Look, we've got a few people on the live stream already, so we might just get underway. So obviously, if hopefully you know where you are. We're at the Sydney DBT meetup. It's our first meetup for the year. Looking forward to hearing from two really good speakers. James Peterson, he's a data engineer at Endeavour Drinks. He's going to take us through principles for your company's first data team, and I think that's oftentimes a lot of startup founders, when they're sort of approaching that time when they're trying to get VC funding and stuff like that, data can be a pretty big consideration. And so making a first data hire and knowing how to establish a good data team can be really beneficial. So looking forward to hearing about all of James' learning there. And then afterwards, we're going to have Pip Sidaway. She's an analytics engineer at NIB. She's going to be taking us through what the fluff is SQLFluff, which is a bit of a play on words there. I'm sure Pips can take us through that. So, linting your SQL, I think, it's one of those good old practices from the Devops space, which I think will be really interesting. I think we've all written and both written and seen terribly written SQL in the past. So I definitely can put my hand up and say that I've written some really terrible one-liner SQL statements. So I think that'll be a really beneficial talk just for readability and just keeping everything clean, which I think is what DBT is all about. I thought I'd make some community announcements before we get started. So DBT, it's a community of learners. It's only been around for about, I think, pretty much 4 years or something like that. So everyone's fairly new. We've got a lot of newcomers. So this is definitely a safe zone. There's no right or wrongs here. We're just really grateful for our speakers to share some great content and share their sort of experiences with us. And it's a great way to network also, these meetups. So we've got a code of conduct, and the TLDR on the code of conduct is just try to be nice to one another, be respectful with your questions, try not to throw too many curveballs, and just be supportive of each other and on all of our learning journeys and stuff like that. So hopefully that all makes sense. Just one other announcement. James Weekly, founder of Omnada, he seems to be everywhere at the moment. He's doing a DBT office hours on DBT ML pre-processing package that he's just built. So I think that'll be really cool. I think that's next week, and he's dropped a link around, and I'll share a link for that after this meetup. But without further ado, James, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter. Let me just share my screen. Radio. Cool. So I was really excited to be able to share some tips and tricks that I've learned about starting a data capability. I imagine pretty much everybody here will already be working in a data team or as the data team. But still, I hope there's some tips and tricks that you can take away. Just quickly, a little bit about me. So my name is James. I'm married to Veronica. Together we have Alfie. And I've been really lucky to learn a whole lot from a bunch of really cool roles in a bunch of really cool places. And of course, DBT is one of those really cool things that I've picked up along the way. I'm a big fan. Been using it for maybe just under 18 months now. And this deck that I'm about to go through, it was originally to help a friend. So he's a non-technical person, he's a lawyer, he's a business person. And he was tasked to start a new data team in their company, in their growing company. So the first thing that he does is he goes to Harvard Business Review and reads a whole bunch of articles about a rapidly declining confidence in data, where executives are seeing themselves as less and less data driven, and that the vast majority of data projects fail. So he's very afraid after seeing those. So he came for some tips and tricks that to help not be another statistic in the data world, and said that this was helpful. So it's great to share it forward again. So we're going to talk about 3 different things. The first thing is around the mindset for a useful data team. How do we actually get data to be valuable and useful in a business? And it's all around how do we impact decisions. The second thing we're going to talk about is just a loop for productive data teams. So how do we pick the right problem? How do we solve for that? And then how do we reflect and improve on our way, how we solve problems so that we can do better and better and better? And from that as well, some tips for prioritizing, so picking the right problem. And they largely revolve around walking before you run and being really careful how you spend. And if you take nothing else today from this talk, other than this, it's to ship early and then iterate. And for a lot of people, this will be a really big cliche, but it's definitely something that I don't see in enough data teams. So a couple of years ago, my wife and I went to Paris. We did all the big fancy things. But one thing that we did, which was really cool, is we went to the Museum of Arts and Trades, just a little bit out of town. And in there, they have a whole room full of vehicles, basically about the evolution of the French car. And it goes from how they basically went and just added an engine to a carriage, right through to adding a steering wheel, brakes, and so forth, to finally having something that actually resembles a modern car. I went and got some examples off the internet. So in 1886, we have Daimler. They threw an engine on a carriage, and it wasn't until 22 years later that you've got the Ford's Model T. In the middle there, you've got 22 years of iterative value. It looks gross. It's not pretty, but it's value where otherwise there would be none. So ship early and then iterate. So the first topic to talk about, how to get value from data. What's that mindset that we need to spread? Just quickly on what's our goal with data. So this is a version of the data maturity hierarchy. You would have seen a version of this before, or 10 different versions. It's a really useful cliche there, because what it says is that things build on each other. So we start with reporting, trying to figure out what happened, and what we're trying to work towards is what should we do to improve what's next. But we can't just jump there. You have to get there iteratively, and just quickly on a couple of ways not to do that. So one way not to do that is to do a thing, throw in analytics, and then view metrics about that thing. It's got to be, in this case, the data wasn't used in that decision, so it's not valuable. It didn't change anything. But obviously a lot of teams do this, and they're encouraged to by executive teams. But it's also a number one reason why most data teams fail. It's because they're not using those metrics to drive those decisions. It's more to reflect on those decisions. Another thing is that we're really hungry for patterns as humans. We like to see patterns of data where there are none. Sometimes it just doesn't exist. And so we'll take assumptions about data as facts, and rather than questions to ask that, and hypothesize about. So in this example, we've got A, B, and C. C's got more goodness. Obviously, C is best, but really what we should be taking away from something like this usually is to hypothesize and test whether that's true. It's more a question to ask than a fact. And that's why this process here is a little bit better, in that what we're looking for from data is to solve a problem, explore ideas for how to solve it, hypotheses, build a cheap experiment, and measure the responses from that experiment. Really evaluate whether the hypothesis is true, and then finally make your decisions on the back of that. Don't make your decisions before any of the above. Otherwise, you're not including data in that learning process. Analytics is really about learning. And it's really valuable to do that. So it means that you don't confuse correlation and causation. It means that you don't overinvest in bad ideas. And when you don't overinvest in bad ideas, it means that you're really reducing your risk. You get to move faster and you have a better hit rate, as in more of your things that you do are actually useful. And you'll see actually an antithesis to this happening all the time, where teams seem to be running really, really well on intuition. And intuition will often coast you really, really well until that intuition runs out, when you hit the walls of that. But because you've been running so fast on that intuition, you can't really stop. It's really hard to stop, create this process, build it in, and then start going again. It's something that will cripple you, is that intuition, rather than that data-driven process. Some helpful tips around that. structure your decisions clearly. So when you've got a decision there, it might be something really ambiguous. Create a framework around it so that it's a clear decision. An example is a couple of years ago, one of the questions I got asked was, should Queensland introduce a state-based income tax? Which is a really ambiguous question, because what is good in that case? Like, it's really quite confusing. So being able to put a framework around it to make it a clear decision means that it'll focus your work a little bit better. Another helpful tip that I find is to pace your metrics with your data volume. Often you'll get a time series metric like this, and an executive will point out at one part over here and say, that's really good. Why was that really good? And another part over here, and that's really bad. Why was that really bad? When really what they're pointing at is just noise. And this is coming back to us trying to find patterns where none exist. So this comes back to pacing the metrics with your data volume so that variances are actually meaningful. As you get, so keep metrics high level and slow at the beginning. And as you get more and more data, increase the pace of those metrics and the detail of those metrics so that you can learn faster. But don't pace your metrics faster than you can really learn with the data volume that you have. Cool. On to second, it's what should we do as that loop, that first, second, and third that I spoke about before. So step one is really to prioritize decisions to improve. Don't work on things that don't matter, and don't work on things that you can't do just yet. Really focus on those low-hanging fruit of things that are easy to improve with data and valuable to improve. And we'll speak a little more in the third part of this on why it's not so simple just to plot these two things. You've got to be a bit pragmatic about it. The second part of this process is to solve for improving that decision. So this is the process that we went through before, but it's also about half of it is about change management, really creating your open journey as you solve that problem so that your stakeholders really believe what you're telling them, really driving the implementation for this and then engineering side of this, and then really making sure that those changes stick. So don't just go out saying like, hey, the solution is there for you. If you want it, you can have it. Otherwise, it's up to you. You've really got to make your work matter. You've really got to drive those changes. That's like half the job, which is not what we signed up for, but it's what we have. And the third step then is to reflect on how to solve problems better. And this is something that you'll find that executives will push back against because it's not immediate value, but it's about building up value for the future. So every time that you improve how you solve problems and you make your solutions either more realistic, more achievable, or higher value, means that your future projects are going to be worth more. So it's an investment in the future. Being able to measure those is really cool. And it's really important to be able to spend time doing that. And so we've got some examples here from this deck that I think everybody in the DBT community will be really familiar with. So data warehousing is actually really powerful. Being able to model data and make it simpler means that your analysis is a lot faster, means that you can do more with it. And so that means that you can basically have less time to do the same output. Another example that I'm sure we're all familiar with is self-service reporting is really, really powerful. If you just have one analyst, they can only do one analyst's worth of work. But if everybody is their own analyst and they understand their own needs a lot better, then suddenly you can do so much more as a collective team. And another example is around data quality. So really being putting in those controls, tests, tracking plans, docs, that's all really, really important things towards having useful data for creating outputs and driving decisions. So if you're not sure what to do for that third step, there's a few examples there. And then just loop back to one. So go back, prioritize a problem, solve it, reflect on how you solved it and how you can improve on that. But sometimes you can't do one if you don't have simple reporting. So in data, our sort of carriage plus engine that I spoke about before, that's just reporting. It's being able to ask good questions so that you can have a good scan of what the decisions are in your business and how they can be improved. So start at step one if you don't have simple reporting. Cool. Now from that, we've got some tips for prioritizing. And I mentioned before, just plot those two things. Like, obviously, you know all the decisions in your business and how valuable they are and how easy they are to improve. Is not that easy. For me, it's actually really, really difficult. And the two sort of stumbling blocks that I see for myself and for other people's all the time is, what is the value of improving one unit in this decision is sometimes really easy. Like, if we improve the conversion rate on our website, sure, that's easy. But if we create a better strategy, what's the value around that? And then my number one tip around here is be pragmatic. You don't have to have a really accurate value on this. All you need is something that's directionally true, so that you can order the value of the projects, of the decisions that you have around you, and have a rough idea on what the return is on effort spent. The other thing that I see a lot is people stumbling over build versus buy for how easy something is to improve with data. So with that, one of my number one tips for that is to value time as dollars. So I try to treat engineers' time as about $1,000 a day and factor that into my build versus buy decision to figure out how much I can do with the resources that I have at hand. What you'll find is that as your needs are simple, as your scale is small, you'll mostly buy. And I say mostly because you'll still have some unique needs. And so you'll have to build some things, but mostly you'll buy. And as you grow in complexity, as you become like Uber scale or Quantium scale, you'll start to mostly build, but not until then. If you spend your time mostly building when your needs are simple, then you're not going to actually get much done. But also as you build and as you factor in what the cost is to build, you've got to think about how deep that building actually is. When your needs are simple and you're still building some things because you've got unique needs, a lot of that time it's still more like assembly than later on when you've got to really do deep builds and build from scratch. And that's a really powerful thing because you've got to factor in what giants can you stand on as you're thinking about this build versus buy decision. So the first tip there is valuing time as dollars. And the second tip is what giants can you stand on? Another tip around prioritization is to make sure that you prioritize good foundations. So some things you can't truly redo. If you set bad code standards or if you let bad data be acceptable, it's really hard to go back and undo those decisions later. Or if you are, say, building on a not very scalable system and you're likely to, or very possibly going to run into huge scale later, don't start with something like, I've seen some SQLite warehouses around, that's kind of crazy. Highly elastic infrastructure like BigQuery or Snowflake scales from $0. In the DBT community, I expect I'm preaching to the choir here. And my last tip there is around don't build something until you need it. It's not valuable to solve until it's a real problem. And as the first data team, you've really got to focus, like be very, very centered on what is the value of how we're spending our time. You'll often get encouraged to go for the big fancy things like data science. Don't start shooting for those straight away. You'll gradually iterate there. Data science is about optimizing and automating decisions. And that's exactly what you're doing the whole time, is you're trying to figure out how do we improve decisions. You'll naturally proceed there as you build up that capability improvement as the third part of that cycle. So to summarize, I'm probably a little ahead here in terms of the time, so I apologize. But in summary, definitely set that mindset. Really focus hard on how do we use data to improve decisions, and distance yourself from any sort of part of the business where data is not being used to improve decisions, because it's just not a valuable use of the data. That cycle is really, really powerful. It sounds simple, it is simple, but definitely follow through on it. Prioritize, solve, and then reflect and improve. And just be conscious as you're prioritizing work to walk before you run. Don't jump straight into data science, and be careful how you spend. you've got to be really conscious of the value that you're bringing. So that's everything from me today. I'll pass it back to Peter.
Wow, thanks so much, James. That was a really cool presentation. I think lots of really good nuggets of wisdom there. I loved how, you sort of evaluating whether to buy versus build, because I think, and sort of putting a value on developer time versus, some particular, data products, there's lots of, I guess, services, Fivetran is quite common and stuff like that. And, when you're going back to the business and saying, oh, this service, it costs, not to single any vendor out, or, like this particular data warehouse costs X amount of money or something like that. It's like, yes, you could view it as quite a big or a reasonable expenditure, but compared to, say, trying to manage, all of these data pipelines myself, or trying to, go through the process of building out a data warehouse on MySQL or Postgres or something like that, potentially, and all of the performance bottlenecks that you might experience, and having to resize the cluster every once in a while. Yes. Any sort of comments on that?
Sorry, I was just going to say that I think Fivetran and Cloud Warehouses are two really good call-outs that you just made on the build verify.
Yeah, and have you got any sort of thoughts on, I guess, how to have those conversations with, say, you're the first data hire. How do you have that conversation with your CEO or, head of engineering to say, it's actually a really good idea to sort of, they're really big enablers and stuff like that?
Yeah. So 2 tips there is around, 1, bring examples. So as you just said, bring the alternative cost of the DIY cost as a dollar value versus the dollar value that you're being asked to pay, say Fivetran or a cloud data warehouse. The other tip is to be open to feedback on that, while also pushing those carrots and sticks. So you've got to do those simultaneously. And what I mean by that is, sometimes other people have really good ideas. An example of this is a year and a half ago, something like that. I wanted to bring in Snowflake to a company, and it turns out legally it was just not a good idea for that company at that time. The other thing is being able to push on those carrots and sticks, being what do people really want for themselves, and what are people really afraid of. So if you can unite your own carrots with theirs and your own sticks with theirs, that helps them understand what you're pushing forward in that vision.
Yeah, awesome. Great insights. Kirk Gardner has asked, love the everyone is an analyst. Did you train people to help find insights, or how did that whole process work?
So good question. I've seen this work somewhere between not at all and very, very well. It's a good question around how did you train people to find insights. I'll bring in a good example to that, and I'll bring a bad example. So a really good example was one that I saw at Uber. So Uber have a 101 course, SQL 101 course, and you actually learn through Uber's own data system, a data structure, how to use SQL. So it means that you understand the data, and they've got quite complex data, as well as how to do like SQL 101. And it's really interesting to see what people do with this. And it's not like analysts, it's often like salespeople or operations managers or strategy background people. It's really, really cool to see like everybody kind of pick it up. They're really good at problem solving themselves. So they're already looking for that structured analytical thinking, and they only need that SQL 101 over the top. So that's a good example. A bad example that I saw was me. Where I went onto a startup and I introduced SQL to a bunch of the non-technical friends there, and that was really, really good. They picked that up really quickly. SQL is something, at least in its basic form, it's something that everybody can kind of pick up. What they really struggled with, and I didn't appreciate until I was really kind of at the end of SQL 101 was they still didn't have the tools for how do I use this in this company? How do I solve the problems that I have? And so going back to that structured thinking is really, really important, not just the SQL stuff.
Yeah, I guess, DBT does offer a few solutions in that front in regards to, say, some of the data lineage, like the DAG, seeing sort of how the different data is constructed. And, I guess directionally you can see, I guess, the tables that are further to the right are probably the more refined. Speaking of which, and buying versus build, oftentimes people running DBT will run it in their own sort of CI/CD pipelines and things like that. But also there's DBT Cloud, and definitely, we're not a sales arm of DBT by any stretch of the imagination, but there are some, I think the Cloud IDE that they've got and things like that, there are some benefits of utilizing that. Do you feel like that's a tool that can I guess enable some folks within the business a little bit like perhaps Looker ML tries to do as well?
Yeah, so I've tried sharing both DBT and VS Code and DBT and DBT Cloud, and I didn't have a great experience either way myself. This is my own experience with sharing that with a relatively new analyst. DBT Cloud was a little bit clunky, really great ideas, but we found it a little bit clunky. This is going back about a year ago or so, so it might have changed quite a bit since. Really love DBT Cloud for the runner. The other one in VS Code was something that was quite new to them as well. So I think it was probably introducing quite a few too many new ideas at once. So I don't have great advice other than like here the stumbling blocks that I've faced.
Yeah, perhaps it might be for the realm of perhaps the visualization layer to solve a little bit of that UX and UI sort of experience for newbie analysts and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think you might be right, I suspect.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to hear anyone's thoughts on that, and I'm sure we can get you on board to share your learnings in that regard. Well, I just thought I'd really say a big thanks to you, James, for the really awesome presentation. I think our crowd's just kind of lack of coffee perhaps is causing them not to ask too many questions. Actually, we've just got one come through from Jonathan Mack. How do you manage quality of SQL written when everyone is an analyst, especially when data team is not new and discoverability may not be top of the agenda? What do you do with governance?
Yeah, I'm actually struggling with this right now, and we've got some good answers so far, but it's still definitely a work in progress. So as a bit of a background, I work with some really, really great analysts right now. Some of them come from like GUI tools background though. So Tableau, for example, where they're not used to writing SQL and especially not used to writing SQL in teams in a shared repo. One thing that we found really, really useful is putting in a style guide. So we use the Mozilla style guide. One thing that we're looking at or thinking about at least is a linter like SQLFluff. So really looking forward to the next talk on that, to introduce standards there. The style guide helped a lot. Also a bit of code review. So often an analyst that we work with, the analyst that we work with will present a correct analysis, and that's really great. But it'll take forever to run on our system. So one thing that's been really helpful there is sitting alongside them and really helping restructuring their code, refactoring their code to help them kind of see like, oh, this is what I could have done different. So the same benefits that you and I get from code review.
Yeah, it does. I think Jonathan's question's a fair question because, in data land, and I think this is kind of what DBT tries to solve, is if you've got 50 analysts, you've got 50 variations of the same SQL code. 50 variations of how to count the number of customers or active policy holders or active,
one thing I did do, is at that startup that I joined, me&u, is to have some really common metrics tables. And then if you find that people are duplicating their own code, to bring it into those common tables, that was really, really useful. So that people can reference that one source of truth. A lot of people, I assume, use LookML for this. I've only seen LookML. I'm looking forward to using it professionally. Another thing that happened was quite similar at Uber. So at Uber, you have a central warehouse, and then teams have their own namespaces. So they can do whatever they want in that namespace. But the lineage is traced. And then when something becomes too dependent on, then they'll start thinking about, hey, how do we bring this into the central warehouse?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good idea is, how do you sort of have this conveyor belt of analysts creating sort of new things in the warehouse, for want of a better word, and then sort of once they become, I guess, a big deal for the business, how do you kind of bring a bit more structure and rigor around them so that maybe they're sort of brought back into, say, the data warehousing team or something like that.
For sure.
A bit more formal. Awesome. All right. Well, James, I think, it's been an awesome presentation. And I'm actually, I think on the DBT local Sydney chat, there's a bit more chatter there, actually. A few folks have been having difficulty getting onto the YouTube chat. So all good. It looks like it was really well received. So thanks so much once again. And we look forward to seeing you around the community again sometime soon. Anyway, yeah, thank you so much. So Pip Sidaway is up next. So Pip's going to take us through SQLFluff. It's like eating your vegetables, isn't it, Pip?
Yeah, sure. All right,
awesome.
Just get this shared. Alrighty. So my name's Pip. I've sort of had an interesting career journey so far, sort of starting in marketing, ended up doing some product pricing. So I worked with our business intelligence team a bit, thought that spreadsheets were pretty cool and fun, and it was something I wanted to delve into. And then, a few years later, I'm now an analytics engineer doing SQL and some cool stuff with data in the technical space. So I've only actually just started using DBT late last year. We had some pilot projects. We were looking to replace some of our on-prem legacy stack. So I'm already hooked. I can see the potential and flexibility of DBT. So I just want to caveat with this. I didn't even know what SQLFluff was at the start of this year. One of our data engineers mentioned it when he was throwing out some ideas of tools and that we could automate it as part of our pipeline. So we had already been trying to work on our coding standards. So it was one of the things we were hoping to develop. So this just further develops that. So this begins my journey about SQLFluff. So just as a bit of a background, so SQL was developed in the 1970s and formalized in 1986, and compare that with Python code that I think was developed in the 80s, then released in 1991. So SQL's been around for a while. Yeah, so it's a language, so people still need to understand it. So you still, while the computer needs to know what you're doing, other people need to read it as well. So our DBT projects, we tend to have multiple people working on them. So the more that we can keep everything quite similar, keep the documentation up to date, it helps everyone just work a bit more efficiently. And as my meme says, future you also needs to understand. So as Peter said at the start, I'm the same. How many times have you looked at your code that you did, like, it feels like not that long ago, and you can't remember what you were doing and you have to go back and try and figure it all out again, whereas if there's been some comments or some doco there, it would have been a bit quicker just to sort that out. As well as that, we expect other people to be able to understand what we're doing as well. So in terms of the way that I do this as well, I try to add a lot of comments into my code because I know that I'm still learning a lot of SQL, and so it helps me when I go back to it, but also helps other people know what you're trying to do. And also we've been using DBT docs as well. So I'm finding that's pretty cool. And so we're learning more about that. So DevOps, this picture actually reminds me of one of our DevOps guys. He's pretty good at making sure that we know that he's there and about the rules that he lives by. So historically, we have tried to implement these types of practices, but they tended to be manual. So it relied on us remembering to do that step. So such as a backup of a stored procedure or some XML code, we'd have a step in our process that manually you had to put it in a repository. Same with the peer reviews, bit of a manual process. You had to get someone to look at it. It wasn't easy, automated. So I love now being able to go into Git and see the last changes made. So comparing whichever version. So recently I did use that feature to reverse out a change that someone else had made, but they weren't actually there. They were off that day. So compared to the sort of trauma that we've had to go through in the past in reversing out a change, I was pretty confident that I could reverse that one out. CI/CD. So definitely something we're embracing. We do have some legacy systems that we need to deal with. So examples might be some of our legacy processes. We have marts where there's not a specific endpoint. So you can't look at the data and go, yep, cool, it's all done. There's sort of iterative updates done to it. But we're currently in the process with this CIDC to look at fixing that. So we're investigating different ways that that can happen. So a standardized way of doing things, similar codes, structure, comments, documentation. So this is where SQLFluff comes in. So what is linting? When I first heard this, I kept thinking about the lint in my dryer and yeah, all the fluff that develops there. So linting's a reasonably new term for me. I don't come from like a software background, I come from a marketing background. So I have been told that there's not many great linting tools out there for SQL compared to other programming languages. Prior to doing this, my 9-year-old was asking what I was speaking about today. So I figured if I could explain it to her and she sort of had an understanding of what it was, maybe I can explain it to you too. So I thought I'd give you the example that I gave her because it was a bit funny. So I told her that if you write a sentence, you miss the capital at the start. Maybe some of the words are all in caps, you forget a comma, the full stop's in the wrong place. The linting tool would come out, look at your sentence, fix up those capitals, sort the commas out, put the full stops in the right place if you've forgotten them. And it's not a spell checker, but it just makes it easier to read. So in terms of at school, they're learning where the comma is to pause and that sort of thing. So it just helps them out. So in focusing on our SQL standards, so we have begun documenting this, and with SQLFluff, it's actually, in looking through it myself, it's made me realize how bad my code has been in the past. So I definitely sort of didn't feel like there was some sort of standards when I first started in this area where I could look at it and go, right, that's how I write SQL code. So I'd often copy and paste things from other projects. Perhaps I'd Google up something, add that in. Things were in capitals or lowercase. Even within the same query, I wasn't really consistent. It did the job. I was just happy that it worked. But in terms of looking at it, it certainly wasn't pretty to look at. So I love rules myself. I always find I want to know where the docker is. I want to know where the rules are. I want a starting point. It's great for new people. So it reduces your workmates having to like politely advise you that maybe you could have done it this way. So as opposed to it being technically wrong, it, I guess, is sort of a way that people like to write their code. So SQLFluff, it's a Python package. So you just pip install it, pretty easy. We use virtual environments, so you can actually put it in the DBT requirements and it just gets installed as part of that. There was a new SQLFluff version released this weekend, so 0.4.0 alpha 3, I think it is, or A3. So they're doing iterations all the time, so it's great. It's still pretty new, but yeah, I've enjoyed playing with it so far. So I use VS Code. It has an add-in for it, which is part of the repository, I think, for SQLFluff. I'll show you an example soon of how that looks. But basically, when you're writing up your code, it will identify if you're breaking a rule. There's also a website, which is an online linter. So if you wanted to just see how it works, take some of your code, paste it in, push a button, and it gives you the nicely formatted SQL. So we use Snowflake, DBT, VS Code. So you can see up on the top there, the double orange lines are highlighting where something might be violating a rule. So that's what I was saying about that add-in. There's a couple of different commands that you can run. So in this instance, we're using a linting command. So this just basically, and I'm just doing this on one file, so you can actually point it to a whole directory, subdirectories, or just single files. You can also just run single rules and things like that as well, but I won't go into that. So for my lovely code that I have here that looks really horrible, I ran the linting tool over it. So this is the results. So it gives you a list of issues. So that first line is the line that it's on, and then the position in the line and the rule that it's breaking. And it gives you a bit of a description there about the rule. But if you need more information, they've got a website that extrapolates and gives you examples as well. So the next one, I tried to do the fix. So I did the linting just to see what might be wrong. I was like, oh yeah, okay, that's all fine and dandy. Yeah, just go and fix this. So run the fix function. You can skip the linting step. You can go straight to the fix. You don't have to lint it first. Sometimes it's good to do it afterwards because there are some errors that have to be manually fixed. So there was 15 violations, which is quite a lot for a little bit of code. Says you want to attempt to fix these. So yes, let's do it. So it goes through pretty quickly, makes some changes and says check your file. So we can now see that my file is looking a lot tidier, but there's still a couple of little orange lines there. So that's telling me there's something still not quite right that the add-in is looking at. So there's a couple of ways we can check what's going on. So you can hover over those lines and it will tell you the rules. So this is LO13 and says an expression without an alias, use explicit as statement. We can also run the linting code as well here. So it gives you the exact line, position and the rule that it's failing on. So in this case, we see that our sum column basically wants us to give it a good name. So it'd be hard for the tool to be able to decide what to name the column for you. So that's one that you'd have to manually fix up. So we can see here the code before and the code after. So it's tidied it up pretty nicely. There are a whole lot of rules in there as well in terms of that are customizable to suit your own coding standards, because everyone loves that argument of what's the best way to do things. So I thought I'd just give an example here. So in the DBT project, you have a SQLFluff file, which is where you set up all the details about the rules that you want to use. So we've got a few exclusions. So you go through the document, there's different dialects. We use Snowflake. Some of the other ones is BigQuery, Teradata, that type of thing. You can set your maximum line length, you can set indents, tabs, all those sorts of things. So it's quite good. So get involved. So argue about the rules. So we set up a Slack channel called SQLFluff on our own Slack just to start that discussion. So we did have some rules that were a work in progress, and it just was sort of like we could sort of talk about things like the indentation and how SQLFluff would work with that. So yeah, it's kind of like a work in progress for us. And the same with the tool, like there's they like to get lots of feedback and things. Some of the examples to think about in terms of rules is like, do you have a limit around your line length, whether you prefer uppercase, lowercase, leading or trailing commas, indentation, tabs, spaces, how many? So yeah, add SQLFluff to your project or go to that website and pop your code in. You can see what it's doing. They've also created a Slack channel. Originally, it was in the DBT Slack space, but now they've actually moved it to their own domain. So there's a whole lot going on in there. So jump in, ask questions. I posted a question earlier this week about some indentation rules, and someone's already created an issue in Git on my behalf to have that more customizable. So the rule wasn't doing exactly what we wanted to do in terms of lining up things. And I think when I last checked it today, somebody had already been working on it and it was looking really cool. So yeah, jump on, like we need more people to get involved because then it'll just make this even better. My engineer said that Pluggy is pretty cool, that they're working on this adding Pluggy in the plugin. So this is just an example of one of the things that's in the Git that you can jump in. So automation, it's a key passion of mine. Everyone calls me the automation queen. So after giving it a go, if it's something that you think will be useful, add it to your pipeline. So we use BuildKite. So it checks your code when you commit it to the branch. However, there's no one else to get angry except myself when I commit the code and actually forgot to run SQLFluff over it before I put it in the repository. So I had a failure. Luckily, it worked the second time around, and our data engineer on the project was very proud of his little linting brush that he added to the build kite as well. So it's a bit of fun. So they have a website, so the web address up there. If you Google SQLFluff, you find all the things anyway. Links to the source, the doco. This is like the doco page for whatever the current stable version is. There's lots of rules, references, examples, heaps of stuff. Plus, like I said on the Slack channel, people seem to be chatting quite a bit. They'll answer questions, that sort of thing. So yeah, so give it a go on your projects. Like I said, I've only been looking at this myself a short time, but learning lots. And in terms of learning lots, just in general about sort of SQL standards as well. And looking forward to like getting this across more of our projects. So my last slide is the obligatory job plug that I said that I was allowed to do. So we have a lot of exciting projects happening at NIB and a couple of jobs available. So look, we're using DBT, Snowflake, BuildKite, getting into Fivetran. I live in Newcastle, but basically our policy now is work from home. So it doesn't really matter where you are. So if you're interested, yeah, let me know and I can send you details. So that's pretty much me.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Pip. That was a really cool presentation. I think SQL linting is awesome because I think there's plenty of examples out there of terribly formatted SQL that could definitely use this. Got a couple of questions come through. So from Al in the DBT local SID channel, did you look at setting up a git pre-commit hook to run SQLFluff before it allows any terrible SQL to be committed? Yeah, I think you answered that question because you were saying that on one of the steps in your BuildKite pipeline, you run SQLFluff. Does that automatically fail the build if a rule is broken?
Correct. Yes, it does. So it does fail the build. So I guess we're going hard, going, not just warnings. So, and also this is like our sort of first project building this out. So we're kind of testing it out too. Yeah, so it's just also understanding and learning about the rules and what applies.
Yeah, cool. I think that, yeah, so I mean, can you tell us a little bit about your environment there, Pip? Is it, like, are you finding that, have you got quite small SQLs or are they like, some of them can be quite big and things like that?
So historically, yes, we have very large chunks of SQL code. That's one of the standards that we're sort of trying to apply now, is to try and break it up a bit more where we can, maybe use some CTEs, like, yeah, some of the code can be thousands of lines long and it just takes so long if you're trying to problem solve it. So with our DBT projects, that's definitely a focus for us in trying not to get those crazy long lines of code.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think Kelly just made a comment in the chat. She loves the automatic fixing of the casing for select statements because I think everyone's OCD really takes a whack when you see all these random capitalized letters throughout your SQL. I mean, I love the fact that you can automatically like skip lines in certain cases to sort of, I like to keep the width of my SQL reasonable.
Like on the one page, yeah.
Yeah, it's just like, oh my goodness, having to scroll right like endlessly to read a SQL statement, it just takes so long. But yeah, cool. Well, thanks so much, Pip. Sounds like there's some pretty cool jobs coming up or already available at NIB. So that's really cool. Definitely go and check those out if you're looking for a new role at the moment. Pretty sure that there's some awesome engineering and data work happening there. So thanks so much. What I might do is I might just finish with a couple of announcements and share my screen, and then we will call an end to the meetup. And yeah, so real quick, just a reminder, I think James has got a James Weekly, another James, he's CEO of Omnada. He is going to be at the DBT office hours, I think it's next week, talking about his DBT ML pre-processing package. I think that'll be really cool. And the other announcement to make, obviously, is we're looking for speakers. So, you know, these meetups don't happen out of nowhere magically or something like that. We're really reliant on our community sort of putting their hand up to, you know, to talk about what they've learned. And look, definitely wanted to call out that, you know, we don't have a really super high bar, you know, in terms of, you know, the quality of presentation. It's just if you've learned something new and you're keen to share what you've learned, whether it's, you know, you're an absolute beginner or a, you know, total expert or anywhere in between, most welcome. Just reach out, and I'm sure it won't take long to get you a speaking slot. So, and, you know, if you do need any help with, you know, sort of prepping up your slides or how to formulate a really good presentation, just reach out. I'm happy to help, and I'm sure there's plenty of other people around the community that can help you out in that regard as well. I think, you know, we're all learning a whole bunch from everything that folks are sharing. But lastly, I just wanted to say another big thanks to Pip Sidaway and James Peterson. I thought both of those presentations were really, really awesome, and I definitely learned a bunch myself. So thanks so much, and we will see you when we get some more speakers. So put your hand up.